Welcome, friends, to this presentation on models for telling community-based history. I am Mark Bowman, Executive Director of the LGBTQ Religious Archives Network, the host of tonight's program. LGBTQ-RAN is a unique venture dedicated to preserving the history of LGBTQ religious movements around the world. LGBTQ-RAN is a digital enterprise. We are not a physical repository that stores papers. We advise and support leaders and groups in their efforts to preserve their records in appropriate archives. Furthermore, we collect and provide a treasure of historical information on our website about LGBTQ plus persons and groups from a wide array of religious expressions around the world. And finally, we encourage research and scholarship in queer religious history. Tonight, we will get an inside look at two new digital projects portraying queer religious history in local communities, one in Boston and one in Washington, D.C. Heather R. White, Ph.D., will facilitate this discussion with Nicole Collins and the Queer Religion Boston exhibit, along with Emma Cieslik and the Rainbow History Project's LGBTQ plus Religion in the Capital exhibit. Collins and Cieslik will lead tours of the online exhibits on queer religious history that they have curated. White will lead discussion on what they have learned in their historical research that would be useful for historians or groups in other locales interested in portraying their history. Heather White, Ph.D., is a specialist in American religious history with a research focus on sexuality, gender, and 20th century social movements. Heather teaches courses in gender, feminist, and queer studies, queer theory and queer politics, sexuality and the history of religion, and the history and politics of religious freedom. Heather's first book, Reforming Sodom, Protestants and the Rise of Gay Rights, was published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2015. Heather serves on the advisory team for LGBTQ-RAN and is a steering committee member of the Queer Studies in Religion group of the American Academy of Religion. Our second presenter, Emma Cieslik, is a lesbian, disabled, and neurodivergent public historian and museum worker based in the Washington, D.C. area. She also researches LGBTQ plus religious history in the nation's capital, developing an exhibit for the Rainbow History Project, and serving as public historian for the Pride Interfaith Service. Emma founded and currently directs Queer and Catholic, an oral history project with the Center for LGBTQ and Gender Studies in Religion, dedicated to recording LGBTQ plus individuals' experiences within and surrounding Catholicism. Our third presenter, Nicole Collins, is a Ph.D. student in religious studies at Brown University, where she studies transgender religiosity in the contemporary United States, specifically trans converts to Judaism. This summer, Nicole worked on developing Queer Religion Boston, a map and living database of the past and present of LGBTQ plus and religion in the greater Boston area. She received her BA from Carleton College and her MTS from Harvard Divinity School. To those of you watching this webinar, we welcome your comments or questions in the chat box or the Q&A function. The presenters will respond to those during the Q&A time toward the end of tonight's program. If you would like to offer personal greetings or comments to the presenters, stay on after the webinar has concluded, and you will be invited into the Zoom room with them. Please direct any technical concerns to Isaiah Poole, who is the tech manager for this Zoom webinar. Now, I am pleased to welcome Heather White to begin this discussion with Nicole and Emma.
It's such a delight, Nicole and Emma, to be here with you and to be able uh, to hear more about your project. So we're beginning with just a little bit of conversation about each of these projects so that we can hear a little bit more about the research. And then we'll transition after that to actually a focus, a tour of each of their projects. So Emma and Nicole, I'm interested, first of all, in what led you to this research focus on religion, and if there's anything in the process of your research that surprised you.
Most definitely. I'm happy to go first. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. For me, I became interested in LGBTQ plus religious identity and communities at the intersections of activism and organizing back when I was studying public history and biology at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana. I had a wonderful mentor named Dr. Emily Johnson, who founded and directs the Muncie LGBTQ plus history project about queer identity in small town East Central Indiana. And while I was starting work on that oral history project, I partly fell in love with oral history as a way to place histories and preserve stories in the voices of people who are telling them, and also to empower people to be their own storytellers. But at the same time, I was deeply interested in questions of religion as someone who was raised in a really conservative Catholic environment, especially as a queer person who was raised in very much purity culture Catholicism of the early 2000s. So for me, I was coming to understand religion and my sexuality at the same time that I was learning this love for oral history. And that pivoted me very clearly into exploring evangelical religions, specifically Christianity and far right Christianity, and intersecting with queerness in rural Indiana. And once I moved to Washington, D.C. to pursue my master's of museum studies at George Washington University, that desire to learn more and explore queerness and religion and how they intersect remained, despite working more centrally in museums and collections management. So I was very fortunate to be put in contact with the Rainbow History Project, a local DC-based history collecting initiative that's working diligently to develop a World Pride exhibit, as DC will be hosting the Pride festivities this upcoming June. And as part of that, they had invited me last year to develop an exhibit about LGBTQ plus religious-led communities and affirming communities. And that's what led me to take on this project as something that started from a budding passion project to something that's led to really wonderful discussions like this here today. My most exciting and surprising find actually has been that while we were doing research about LGBTQ plus religious organizing, there was a wealth of information that I had found related to the early Mattachine Society. Specifically the Mattachine Society and its Committee on Religion and the Homosexual. And so pivotal conversations were actually taking place on American University's campus at this time about what a future related to religion and spiritual identity would be involving religious leaders and religious communities moving forward. One of my favorite moments is that there is a copy of one magazine titled Homosexual Servant of God, ? In the National Museum of American History's collection, focused on their LGBTQ plus history initiative. And in the magazine, it explores firsthand accounts of mainly white, cis, gay men, navigating what it means to be religious and spiritual and also claim their identities. So that's been one of my favorite and most surprising, but most joyful finds of the project.
Wow. Thank you, Emma. And Nicole, what about you?
Yeah, and thank you for that response, Emma. That was wonderful. On my end, I attended Harvard Divinity School. I'd sort of grown up in the Boston area and am trans and had kind of, come of age and come out in the Boston area and kind of found my footing there, but in a what one might call secular environment. And then at the same time as I started at Harvard Divinity School, I began a conversion to Judaism in a Brookline-based synagogue that actually ended up on the map, which I can point out later. But I sort of found out that during my conversion, whenever I talked to other people sort of just getting to know folks in the synagogue, specifically queer and trans folks in the synagogue, they would always point to some other religious organization or group of people like, oh, you should go chat with them, you should go talk to them if you want to meet more queer and trans religious folks. And eventually I just realized that while I was relatively familiar with the LGBTQ history and histories of Boston, there was nothing really written on its specifically queer religious history. And so that was sort of what inspired the project on my end. And the biggest thing that surprised me was how eager people were, congregations and organizations were to have their information put on the website for this project. And I guess I just sort of wasn't sure what to expect, again, because there didn't seem to be any kind of precedent for this sort of thing. I wasn't sure if, putting this information on a website might be unjustly like grouping people together in a way that might feel artificial, or perhaps it was like a privacy thing. But everybody I reached out to was very, very excited to have their information spotlighted, I think both as a way to preserve the really rich and important queer religious history of Boston, but also to serve as a resource for queer and trans folks who are looking for a religious home in the area. So.
Wow. I mean, I love so much that you all have jumped into like researching the details of religion in each of the cities that you're located. So Washington, D.C., Boston, Massachusetts. And I'm interested in what ideas you have about how the specific location, about how the specificity of the capital or the specificity of the Boston area is part of what you found. So I guess another way to ask this question would be to say, is there anything that you found about religion and LGBTQ history that you think may be particular to your location? And let's just continue. Emma, we'll start with you again.
100%. Thank you, Nicole. That was a wonderful answer and very much reflected as well with the Rainbow History Project. There wasn't a lot of information about LGBTQ plus religious-led and affirming communities in the Washington, D.C. area, but very much because it was based in D.C., a lot of activism and organizing surrounding LGBTQ plus rights were, along with other civil rights movements, aligned with religious and spiritual organizations. So what was really unique to the Washington, D.C. area was a lot of mobilizing organizations and leaders that provided space, access, and resources for people in the capital, both people based in the area and people coming into the area for political protest and acts of revolutionary action. They were really bolstered by these religious communities, and these religious communities were very much led by queer people throughout from the 1950s to present. Even though there wasn't as much recorded in the record related to people that were leading these communities directly, there were many key players who were queer and acting in leadership roles. So for me, the one thing that was specific to DC was finding a real home in people past and present that were leading activism and organizing change, especially today with what's going on currently at the Supreme Court surrounding queer revolution and the fight for rights that was based in religion and spirituality. Even I know today, several people that I've been working with based in the DC area that are religious leaders and key organizers related to local faith initiatives have been down at the Supreme Court organizing and fighting for rights related to trans individuals and gender affirming care.
Yeah, and at least on my end, I don't think it's too much of a hot take to say that DC and Boston both have a similar kind of like mythic place in the American imaginary. And so I think, at least in the specific instance of Boston, so much of religion in all of its forms served as sort of a basis and kind of a connecting knot of intersectional organizing for several decades now, and particularly surrounding civil rights and surrounding the AIDS epidemic. And I think what I have found the most rhetorically interesting in looking at these histories, particularly in the past like 10 to 20 years, is the way that a lot of these congregations will kind of look back, and when they sort of, in the few descriptions they have on their websites about their sort of like queer religious pasts, they will relate the history of like religious queer organizing in their congregations to the religious history of Boston, going back to the the founding of the city in the 1600s. And so I think that's very interesting, the way that they almost seem to attempt to do like a queerly affirming, like reparative reading of the history of the city of Boston in service of, reimagining the relationship between queerness, transness, and religion. And the Old South Church, for example, has, I had the list somewhere, but it boasted a really rich history of previous congregants. Phyllis Wheatley, I believe that was the right one. Phyllis Wheatley was there. I believe, and Franklin as well, unless I'm misremembering. I'm quite nervous for this webinar, so the names are escaping me, but there are many famous people who were congregants at this one specific church, and a lot of the messaging on the website reflected that in a way that I thought was really interesting.
It makes so much sense as I'm listening to both of you, that the history that you've uncovered, and especially the queer religious history that you've uncovered, would have a deeply anchored sense of place in the city that you investigated. And so there's always an and to this. I've been really intrigued in my own research at how frequently community historians have found this like peculiar example of religious support and thriving sort of religious communities. And especially in the examples that are really early on, they often, the conclusion is often that the particular city is distinct, unique in some way. And neither of you are jumping to that conclusion. But there is a way that it might be easy to imagine that DC is the capital, or Boston, with especially its rich history of divinity schools and religious education and liberal religion, right? That there might be something unique about these places that would distinctively give rise to queer religious flourishing. And yet, right? And yet, I think it's, one of the things that we find in looking across these different locations is that every city, every locale, every site has its distinct queer religious history. So I'm really interested in what advice you two would give for historians and community scholars who are interested in finding out about their own locale's distinct queer religious history. So if someone wanted to look at Cincinnati or Atlanta, what suggestions would you offer about how to proceed? What lessons do your site studies offer for how to do this kind of work?
Most definitely. That's such an important and critical question. From my perspective in Washington, D.C., one of the most instrumental and helpful ways for me was currently in the city, we have the Pride Interfaith Service. It's based out of Center Faith in Washington, D.C. And this service has been going on for many, many years and has kind of been a central fixture of the community through the HIV and the AIDS crisis as a space for interreligious dialogue and organizing. So when I was first coming to the Rainbow History Project, I was digging into the archives, and one of the most helpful resources that I found was the Pride Interfaith Service that I had already begun to collect and to curate their own histories. So for them, I believe in 2014, it was a moment of understanding the impact that their past events had of bringing people together and providing space and visibility for queer affirming religious communities, but also to the impact that they had looked back at each other and realized that their own histories were powerful to show that queer-led and queer-affirming religious communities were not just a modern thing, but they have rich and deep pasts. So in 2014, they had started to set out and record these histories, and it was a wonderful jumping off point for me then to learn more about the community and to have community contacts. And very much in the same way, I would say for anyone who is eager to collect these histories, really reaching out to religious communities, going to the archives, yes, and sometimes organizations have already undertaken collecting some of their preliminary histories, but also thinking critically about how contemporary activism through religious organizations is also a conduit for understanding its past and how it came to be. So for me, I really recommend anyone who can find a similar organization as Pride Interfaith Service and Center Faith, who can find that work that's being done on the ground, who can find people at the Supreme Court this week, who can find people at the White House, potentially in the near future, outside, can really be doing the boots on the ground work and can provide good contacts. And many of these organizations recognize that their elders, their religious elders, are aging in the community, and they want to make sure that these histories are recorded. So at the last Pride Interfaith service, there was a memorial for one of the critical founders of the Pride Interfaith service, who had unfortunately passed on. And a lot of that moment was remembering and recognizing the history and making sure it was written down. So I will say, if there's any contact that you can make with present organizers, they are wonderful conduits and caregivers for the past and what they're hoping to collect. I will also shout out the Pride Interfaith Service is planning another event this upcoming June on June 3rd. So we're also eager to explore in greater depth this history through the service itself, so that understanding and appreciating our histories is also a spiritual experience itself, and understanding how deeply rooted we are in faith communities, but also in queer reactionary action.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say much the same thing, that my quick and kind of tongue-in-cheek response to advice is sort of just talk to people. And I think, again, sort of as I mentioned in one of my previous answers, that I was kind of floored with how eager these organizations were to get their information out there and to get their archives, read and sort of organized and chronicled on the website. And Facebook ended up being actually a hugely helpful way to reach out to anybody who even had a kind of like peripheral connection to some archive or some organization, former, present or previous in the Boston area. And so I was able to get a huge list of congregations and groups that I hope to soon, perhaps this summer, continue to add to the website. But just sort of taking informal venues, again, like Facebook, just sort of reaching out to people, going to services and asking around, all just great ways to actually get the, again, it sounds very corporate, but like the sort of networking opportunities to be able to get this information together and up and, publish or just put somewhere. And that was just, I think, the biggest piece of advice I can give people who want to do something like this. And also reach out to us, because it would be great to have a list of all these sorts of projects together. So.
And I love that last suggestion, Nicole, that we should keep a list of what's happening in different locations. My last question, and we don't have a lot of time because we do want to hear more about each of your projects, but it is as briefly as you can. If you had a magic wand and could extend your projects to something bigger, what would be a key question or a key priority for further research in community-based religious history?
That's a wonderful question. I think for me, the big priority would be not only funding that would be able to acknowledge and reciprocate for people's hours of labor. I think often in history work, and especially in museum work where I spend most of my day, there's often an expectation of free labor for passion or documenting your community. But I think it's especially important that people are paid for the work that they do, both physical and emotional labor. So for me, it would be having the funding to provide for people to do this work full time, but also to have the opportunity for time of setting aside opportunities to speak and conduct oral history interviews with community members. The Rainbow History Project is wonderful in helping to train and employ a new generation of oral historians at the local level in Washington, D.C. And I wish there was more time and space to do that before stories are lost, just as I was sharing with the Pride Interfaith Service. I don't think in that instance it was lost. In essence, the memorial was a space to come together and remember histories and cherish them. But in the future, moving forward and making sure those are captured, because my biggest emphasis would be how can we capture intersectional and diverse stories in the voices of people who lived through them. I know one of my goals moving forward is to capture LGBTQ plus pagan communities' histories, which are often left out of the scope of queer religious studies. The Pride Interfaith Service, there are several wonderful people who are on the planning committee who have done instrumental work in incorporating pagan communities into the interfaith celebration. And it would be dedicating time and space to collecting those stories, but also doing outreach. Just as Nicole said, it's incredibly important to know what other projects are out there. So that would be my big question is where can we go from here? And who all can we mobilize to collect these histories?
Yeah, I mean, I second everything you said, especially about time and money. Those are the bottom lines here, literally and metaphorically. And so it's frustrating, looking at projects like these and feeling just sort of deeply wishing that we had more time, that we had more funding or people to, like paid assistants to come help us just do the manual labor behind, like literally just going and archiving and sort of just keeping track of everything, having spreadsheets of where all the information is we want to be able to collect and keep track of. But I think in a sort of more abstract sense, and this will become clearer as we do like the technical demos of each of the exhibits, but I did a map for my exhibit. It was sort of a map showing important locations for the sort of past and present of queer religiosity in Boston. And something that I grappled with, and I'm continuing to grapple with this project is, what are the benefits and drawbacks of a map format for this kind of exhibit? What is necessarily lost in such a format? How can it kind of be flattening in a way, again, like literally and physically, to point to one place on a map as the location of where some event or organization was in the history of queer religion in Boston, because certainly these things move, they're not always centralized, and I wonder what gets left out when we look at things in this specific spatial sense. And another small thing, we want to add like a time slider at some point so we can also kind of underscore, again, like I said, these organizations moving and these congregations, especially because of histories of gentrification having to move out of where they were for so long. So lots of things, hopefully exciting coming in the future.
This makes me eager to hear more about each of your projects. So I'll turn it over to Emma first, to be followed by Nicole to show us more about what you've been researching. Thank you so much for your remarks.
100%. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So everyone on the screen, I'm a trained audio describer, so I always try to incorporate visual descriptions into my content. So on the screen is a section, the introductory page of the Omeka LGBTQ plus religion in the Capitol exhibit. So it's a digital exhibit, and you'll notice that on the right side of the screen, there are different tabs from the 1960s through the 2000s, separated by decade largely. Focused with headers based on what key events and movements were happening historically during these eras related to LGBTQ plus religiosity. So people have the opportunity to toggle between decades, but unlike it being a straight timeline, it's based thematically. So specifically in the 1980s, there's discussion about HIV and AIDS crisis care in queer ministry and how that very much mobilized the queer faith-based communities to come together, including the Pride Interfaith Service. So for me, the whole exhibit is based on the Omeka software. It's a really wonderful software that the Rainbow History Project uses as their digital collections database. So the wonderful part about it is as I toggle through, and you'll see, I'm able to actively embed object information in it so that people can actually click from the narrative content, and I'll toggle to the 1960s one so you can see. So people can toggle between different content, say this image of Jack Nichols at a meeting of the Mattachines Committee on Religious Concerns, and find all of the information related. So source material, date, rights information for copyright, but also original format information. So it's a wonderful way to embed content and also have that level of accountability and transparency of where materials are coming from. So this site provides space to toggle through these different communities and different movements. Largely, it is increasingly focused on Jewish and Christian communities, which is by nature just of the Judeo-Christian framework for documenting LGBTQ plus religious communities, but something, again, as I referenced before, I'm hoping to change. But as I toggle through this, it's organized by religious community. So until the 1990s and the 2000s, we really don't dig into queer pagan communities in the DC area. But as I mentioned, it goes through critical documents that are in the Rainbow History Project's collection. It also explores how communities were changing and new identities were made, especially in 1975, queer Jewish religious communities that were founded solely for identity and continuity, separate from other mainline synagogues. And I've also been able to embed, along with material content, actual oral history content. So people can listen to others' voices, listen to oral history interviews that have already been collected that touch on religion. My goal long-term would be to actually conduct interviews focused solely on religion and queerness, but of course, time and money and all the resources in the world. Still waiting on that magic wand. So as I toggle through here, you'll see that I also have content for the 1980s, the 1990s, specifically in the 1990s, the growth of open and affirming communities of worship. And as Nicole said, there is a goal down the line. Pride Interfaith Service is working closely towards this, of creating a database of open and affirming congregations affiliated with this. So people not only understand which communities they may feel more welcome in or more affirmed in, but also can understand the history of those communities and where they came from. And then in the final one, in the 2000s, we look forward to religious community activism and diversity. So this one especially highlights the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence based in Washington, D.C., who have been key activists in the area and also present a different model of religious activism in the Washington, D.C. area that's outside of what may be considered a traditional religious community or movement. And so the wonderful part about this, again, highlighting Wiccan and pagan communities that were founded in this area. And again, as I'm hovering my cursor over the screen about stepping out, this was a Thanksgiving interfaith celebration focused on LGBTQ plus religious history. So this was one of those pivotal documents that a friend had recommended to me that provided those key timelines to move forward and understand where I could get started and who I could reach out to. But along with this central exhibit site, I was also incredibly privileged to work with the Washington Blade. And in this past Pride, had the opportunity to write documents, write a 3-part article series focused on LGBTQ plus religious history in the Capitol. So some of these pulled content directly from the Washington Blade archives, including this photo of Frank Kameny, but also allowed me to dig deeper into the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence and their tradition of lavender mass, which wasn't quite captured in this online exhibit, but was kind of a reactionary response to the red mass that usually happens within the Catholic Church, that recognizes civil servants that have been taking on traditional Christian values. And so immediately after the fall of Roe v. Wade, the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence had already understood the connection between trans rights and access to gender-affirming care and the fight for reproductive justice. And so at the same time, understanding that, they had held and kind of reimagined their traditional lavender mass as a reaction to celebrating leaders who were instrumental in that decision to strike down Roe v. Wade. So it was a space where I could share more of this history. And through the Washington Blade, I had a chance to get in contact with and reach out to community members who wouldn't normally come onto the exhibit website or know about Rainbow History Project, but just be deeply interested in these pieces of history that maybe they're connected to, maybe they're not, but they want to learn more. So it's been a very exciting project so far, but the Emeka software has also been wonderful in that it is completely versatile and easily updated. So a lot of these moments have happened where I get put in contact with another community leader who either corrects something or adds greater depth. So I love that this software provides space for histories to change and evolve, but also to deepen and become more intersectional. So I'm very grateful to be able to share this exhibit with you all. It was a true work of passion and something that I hope to continue doing moving forward in the future, and also incorporate into Pride Interfaith Service events and workshops down in the future in June 2025. And with that, I'll pass it to you, Nicole. I know we're short on time, and I want to make sure we have lots of time.
Cool. Yeah, totally. Thank you so much. All right, I'm going to hope that the sharing works. I will be showing you guys the map that I did for this project. And since we have about 30 or so entries, I obviously will not be going through more than one or two of them. But basically, this is the landing page that I'm looking at right now of the exhibit Queer Religion Boston. I made this in about 15 minutes in Canva. And so the website and a link to this site will be distributed, I believe, at some point after this webinar. But when you go on the website, you can see I have a pretty lengthy description just on the landing page, just describing the history of the project and what it is sort of trying to emulate. I also have notes on the sort of three key terms in this title, Queer Religion Boston, which is a little, basically the bottom line for all three of these terms is that all of them are kind of umbrella terms that when you get down to the brass tacks can be kind of inaccurate or at least too abstract at times. And so I sort of clarify and give further reading on each of these terms as much as I can on such sort of a lofty topic. And then I also note on the site just about safety, like if there's any, concern at some point that one of the congregations who had previously, given us their information and address wants it taken away, like we will do that. Sort of just stuff like that on here. And this just sort of points toward different future directions you want to take the project in. So again, lots of interesting stuff on the site if you want to browse this afterward. And then I also point to some other just histories, completely non-exhaustive on Boston's quote unquote secular queer history. And then I also just have a more technical list of features we want to add soon to the map, which these won't make sense until I show you the map. So I will do that now. This is the map. Again, if you are interested in checking this out in your free time, we have a complete list of all the entries on the map, like in text format. So you can just click from entry to entry and they all have their own little description. I would say about 75% of these entries are done. Some of them are sort of still being written, i.e. I will continue them over winter break when I am done with my semester. But for the most part, you can sort of zoom in and see where in Boston and sort of for what years these congregations and groups are around. So let me go to one I know for sure is actually fully written. But this is what I was looking for. Okay, the Old South Church, you can see its title, the address, and then the year it was founded. Sometimes this kind of varies. I will usually just give an estimate in which case. And then it'll give the denomination of the religion, if that's applicable. If not, I just leave that blank. And then you can click on the entry on the map, and then it'll bring you to a separate tab that will show you, again, sort of the information we went over before, and then a description of varying length. Some of these are quite long, or quite short, of the history of the organization or the group or the congregation based on how much I was able to find either through archives or on their website or in online articles. And so it'll have, I will say, a pretty detailed description, and then sources and other sort of like leads on this information if you want to go down a really interesting rabbit hole. And then I will also, for all the pages, have either other congregations that are mentioned in the sort of like blurb for each organization, or just ones that are like geographically proximate or thematically similar. And so here for the Old South Church, it's the Arlington Street Church, and I will click on that in a second. But on the bottom of each page, you can see a version of the map that just has that one, congregation on it. Okay, this is really slow, but basically, yeah, you can just zoom in and see where it is and then click on it. It'll tell you that this is the Old South Church. And then if you want to go to another relevant organization, you click on relevant pages and it brings you there. Okay, I think that was everything. The other thing I will mention before I stop sharing is that you should, if you are interested in participating, or if you have any feedback or any suggestions for things for me to add to the map or the exhibit writ large, you can fill out this Google form, and it will tell me if it's filled out, and I will reply. Yeah, I think that's everything for my exhibit.
So exciting. And two such fantastic projects with so much to explore in the details of those websites. I know let's see, there is a chat to see if there are questions. I'm scrolling over to see if, folks, let's hear some more. So I see that there's a question about the lavender red mass. And I wonder if you could say more, because there's at least one person, and I'm sure more, who are eager to hear about that particular service.
I would love to. It was one of my favorite things that really connected past queer religious histories to present. So the Red Mass traditionally is held around October and commemorates civil servants in the government who are dedicated to Christian values. So traditionally, the Lavender Mass has actually been going on for 5 years, so prior to the fall of Roe v. Wade. And it was founded by a member of the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence who was raised Catholic. And it was very much this understanding and reaction to, I'm a queer person, and there's so much of the Catholic ritual that I love and appreciate, but I don't always feel very welcome in Catholic spaces, including in some Washington, D.C. Catholic churches. So it was very much a space where, how can I hold on to those rituals and that symbolism and things of my childhood that I remember and appreciate and still feel are mine in a new way. So they had founded this Lavender Mass before Roe v. Wade had fallen, committing to trans rights. And so it had continued for several years and traditionally took place at the Memorial for the Nuns of the Battlefield, based in Washington, D.C. So it was directly across from one of the largest Catholic churches and one of the home ones for the bishop in the area, so that it would kind of be a counter protest, a religious counter protest to the Red Mass that was happening on the same day. It changed locations on the year after Roe v. Wade, just because of, I believe it was rain or either other weather-related issues on the same day as the Red Mass. So it switched to be the day of the Women's March and the March for Reproductive Justice. So it actually took place in a park about a block away from where the march began, of sisters coming in full regalia together to hold a mass space and come in community to celebrate, but also to recognize and affirm that the fight for reproductive justice also has to be trans inclusive and has to be centered on trans rights. So it was wonderfully impactful, especially at a time when discussions about trans reproductive justice and trans reproductive rights were not as well centered, and they still do not remain as visible and as recognized as they need to be. But it was a really powerful service. So I was able to attend and visit, and I've put in the chat the link to the piece that I wrote on it. So it was a fun third piece where I could talk about how queer religion extends into the contemporary in Washington, D.C. But that's a wonderful question. I could talk about it all day long.
I know. I don't see I don't see other questions yet, which is great because I get to ask a question. So I'm going to pass on a question that is often asked of me. And I'll say the question is, do you see a particular denomination or tradition that has been especially important sort of in the context that you're researching? And that has been adamantly true for me because I've been focusing on New York City, where the Episcopal Church and the Episcopal Diocese of New York and the Church of the Holy Apostles in particular has been really important in shaping especially early histories of queer activism. And I'm wondering if either of you have and maybe starting with Nicole, if you found that there's a particular tradition or set of traditions that stand out as especially significant in the context of your study.
Totally. Well, I guess here I'll give a roundabout answer in terms of what you mean by my study, just because in my PhD program, I study specifically like trans Judaism and trans converts to Judaism. And I found it, at least on a personal level, really, really exciting and kind of mind-blowing to see the ways that early queer Jewish communities in Boston in like the 70s and 80s formed. And similarly, how quickly the one big organization, B'nai Haskalah, fizzled out. And I think it's just fascinating that was sort of like a spark on the queer Jewish scene. And then for a period, if I remember correctly, of like 3 or 4 years, nothing. And then it kind of reemerged as the LGBTQ Jewish organization that is now called Antikva, which is now a part of the synagogue that I'm a part of now. And so all of these paths, I guess, cross eventually. But that was both exciting in a personal sense and also very interesting to see the ways that over time the question of transness and the consideration of transness became more and more of a focus, like, as Emma had sort of mentioned in a different context. But here for Jews over time, especially the past 10 years in this newest iteration of the group, the consideration of transness and religiosity really became foregrounded in a way that I think is very exciting. And while it is obviously not a linear move, it is one that is, again, personally very exciting. And I think that will also answer Rachel's question about my favorite finding from my research as a Jewish person.
Well done. I'll jump in and forward another question. So this is a question about Black, queer, and trans communities, and especially spiritual religious practices that are not affiliated with any one religious tradition. So trans religious spiritual practices, but have various belongings and practices that overlap at events like parties or protests. Wow, I am really interested in the possibilities for this question. So maybe as Emma records religiosity of pagan communities, for example, she may have insight. But is there anything else that comes to mind? Are there strategies that you can think of for recording the sacred that shows up as a social occasion rather than weekly gatherings, or that sort of it sounds like might be more dispersed in examples like parties or protests? I would love to hear from either of you if there's something particular that comes to mind with that.
There is. Do you mind if I jump in? And cut me off. Yes, I want to make sure that you also have time to respond, Nicole. So I'll put it in the chat. One of my favorite projects that I've also undertaken is I previously worked at the Smithsonian Folklife Center, so the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, a unit based out of the Smithsonian Institution. And as part of that, we had the chance to dig into stories for me related to art and religiosity. But one of my favorite artists is Lonnie Johnson, who explores very much this kind of nebulous religious experience. And Lonnie has done a lot with a recent exhibition focused on ancestral spiritual memory through altars. And her work focuses on religion outside of mainline affiliations and communities, and one that's built on interactions of Santeria, traditional African-American spirituality, West African spiritual traditions, and ones that don't really fit into congruous communities, but ones that very much intersect with queerness. So I definitely recommend the article because Johnson was instrumental in creating an exhibit honoring queer Miami-based religious individuals, and had created small mementos and informed people on and held workshops on how to create altar spaces for queer Miami residents and discussing ideas of storytelling and memory and spirituality. So I could talk about it all day, but I will say that Lonnie Johnson is a wonderful person to look up related to this. And this is an approach that I hope to take with exploring pagan communities, is recognizing how there spirituality isn't necessarily something that's attached or tethered to a specific institution or organization. And I'm really eager to highlight people and smaller communities who have been pioneering at this as well. I recently, this past month, time is an illusion now. I had published an article in Them magazine focused on non-binary, trans, and gender expansive individuals within pagan communities that have been leading the charge for leadership. So my goal with that is to highlight how trans and non-binary individuals are pioneering and changing the fabric of their very organizations and covens to make them more inclusive, but also how that history is deep and rich and tied to many different locations, but also people who have done the work and put boots to the ground to change the fabric of the organizations and traditions they're part of.
Thank you.
There's a question for Nicole.
No, this is so perfect. Thank you so much for Emma for that. And I'm excited to explore that link as well. So Nicole, I'll just read this. As you've been mapping, have you noticed any interesting patterns or differences in the way that various faith traditions welcome queer congregants or do outreach to queer communities?
I'm muted. Okay, so to actually just give my take quickly on the previous question and then go to this question, just to answer specifically to the part of the question about strategies for recording the sacred, that kind of loops into. So I will preface this by saying I'm not a programmer. I'm a religious studies student, so I've really got to wrap my mind around how to do this. But as I kind of hinted toward before, I really want to sort of make the way that we do this map a little more expansive and more open to things like different entries on the map and more open to the question of like what gets on a map and what gets on this map. And I'm thinking about like events and thinking about additionally to like how do we change the location of each of these congregations like by year or by a year that they move, which in terms of like mapping software is much more complicated to do than it seems. And part of why I'm going to figure this out next summer. But I think there are, sort of things like incorporating events to sort of like de-emphasize the role of centralized, organized religious institutions. And so sort of emphasizing that as well as artifacts is another thing I really want to be able to map and locate and kind of connect across to these different entries on the map in order to give what is happening on there both kind of like temporal element and a spatial element that isn't necessarily captured by its currently like more static setup. So these are all things that are on the horizon that I hope will make the map like more amenable to like the question said, like the sacred as it shows up as a social occasion rather than as weekly gatherings, presumably also to add to that, like in one place forever. And so, yeah, and that's sort of what I'm hoping to do with that. And then I'll just, I don't know if I have enough time to fully answer the question from Jeff, but I will just note that obviously all of these organizations and all these congregations have incredibly rich and different queer religious histories, deeply, deeply different, obviously, based on religion and denomination as well. But I will just note that I think, especially among like the Old South Church and the Old West Church in Boston, these churches that have this rich history of sort of like coalitional and intersectional, queer organizing, in both the quote unquote religious and secular have, I think, very distinct ways of reaching out to and incorporating queer folks into their worship and just into their community making in general that I believe differs quite greatly from example how local synagogues do. Okay, since we only have a few minutes, I'll leave it at that, but thank you.
And I'll ask for like a 30-second summary for this. I'm actually going to take it. I'm going to meld in the last question from Eric. So what would be your just quick advice for a basic starter step for an individual getting started documenting their local history? So quick response from each of you. What's the first step?
That's a really good question. Shout out to Eldridge, who is amazing. But I would say the best starter step is to find organizations that have already begun collecting these materials, so Rainbow History Project. And if you can't find an organization that's already begun collecting, start that yourself. So you need primary source materials. It's an incredibly critical step. So make sure that you can start documenting, but also find and identify and record the stories of community elders. So elders are going to be the people who, as Nicole said, allow networking, who enable wonderful conversations and connect you. So find those elders in the community, collect your source material, and find people who are committed to these stories just like you.
My take on this, don't be scared to start a spreadsheet. I think that was massively important for me doing this, particularly given the format was a map. And so to have one place where it was like, this is the person or this is the group and this is the place, these are the links, this is the description, and then go from there. It was just so much easier after a while than having a bunch of like random notes in a notebook going on for pages and pages. And I think that can be a great form of momentum for starting these projects and being like, okay, now that this is here, this is who I should reach out to. This is where I should go next geographically in the area, etc.
I love this. I love that we ended up with where to start. And with that, I'm going to turn this back over to Mark. Thank you, everyone who has attended this event. And thank you, Nicole and Emma, for your fantastic work.
Thanks, Heather, Emma, and Nicole, for this fascinating and inspiring program. And thanks to all of you who participated and offered comments and questions and encouragement. Within a few days, you will all receive an email with a link to the recording of tonight's program that you can share with friends and colleagues. If you are interested in more opportunities to explore the history of queer religious movements, check out the LGBTQ-RAN website and particularly our events page. There you will find announcements of future online programs as well as recordings of past presentations. Our next program will be on Thursday, January 16th, honoring our LGBTQ plus religious elders, in which Rabbi Camille Shira Angel will dialogue with students from this innovative class she teaches at the University of San Francisco. Then, on February 12th, we will collaborate with WATER, Women's Alliance for Theology, Ritual, and Ethics, to present Charlotte Bunch, lesbian feminist activist with religious roots, in conversation with Mary E. Hunt. Go to the events page on our website for more details and to sign up for these groundbreaking online programs. In closing, I remind you that LGBTQ-RAN is the first and foremost source of information on LGBTQ plus religious history. We are a very small operation that is funded through the generosity of friends like you. So if you would like to see more programs like this one, and if you share our commitment to ensure that future generations will hear our voices and stories, please help make this happen with your gift. You can either go to giveq.org, that's giveq.org, on your phone, tablet, or laptop, or click on the donate button on the LGBTQ-RAN homepage. With your credit card in hand, it only takes a couple of moments to make a gift, and your gift will make a difference. On behalf of everyone here, I offer much gratitude to Heather, Nicole, and Emma for all their work and for this thoughtful presentation. Good night to all.